Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. I'm your host, Kim Simone, here with co-host Mark Lenzi. How are you this week, Mark?
Everything is great, Kim. How are you?
Good. I'm all right. And we have another special guest with us this week who I had the pleasure of meeting in person at the Boston Wine Expo. We have Mark Davidson from Australia here to talk to us about Australian wines and his book. And I know you don't currently live in Australia, correct, Mark?
That is correct. I actually live in the US. I've been in the US for now 10 years. I haven't actually lived in Australia for quite some time. I was in Canada for a good portion, between Toronto and mostly in Vancouver. Lived in San Francisco for a bit. Now I live in Des Moines, Iowa.
Ooh, all over the place. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about what you do, what you have been working on, and the kinds of stuff that you're into in the wine world?
Cool. Yeah, well, my background is hospitality all the way. That's kind of went through hotel school back in Australia and then sort of angled towards wine at a certain point. I ended up traveling a fair bit, meeting people, traveling around different parts of the world, basically following women, which might be something I need to have a closer look at. But ended up in Canada, Vancouver for a good portion of time, and then I was living there between there and San Francisco through work. I was back and forth with San Francisco. I met who was my now wife in the wine business, and we did back and forth between Des Moines, Iowa, and Vancouver. And then at some point, it was a bit of a like, what are we going to do here? But if we're going to move forward with this, someone's got to move. So I moved. As a small child growing up in Sydney, I thought, when I make it, I'm moving to Iowa. Said no one ever.
Of all the places to move to, Iowa.
Exactly.
For love.
That's what you do. So yeah, what I do though for work, it's a bit of a funny job for most people because I don't sell wine, I don't buy wine, but with a sommelier background, I've gotten involved in education for Wine Australia, which is the generic body that promotes Australian wines around the world. So I'm in charge of education for North America, a job I actually did globally for Wine Australia for a period of time, but mercifully I'm now just sort of focused on the US. And so yeah, marketing, education, promotion work, but mostly the education piece of it. So getting around doing the kinds of seminars you saw me at, either at the school or at various conferences and with various organizations, be it Guild Soms, Court of Masters Sommeliers, or the Institute of Masters of Wine, just focusing on Australia.
So, Mark, can you explain to our listeners, you're the head of education in America for Wine Australia. Can you explain about Wine Australia? Is it a government-funded organization, or is it winery-funded?
No, it's a bit of both. There are levies that pay towards us, and it's matched by other government funding. So we are a government organization, but we are budgeted according to each market in terms of how much levies are charged to wineries, which are then matched. So yeah, we are government funded.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean, it's, the budgets do sort of breathe in and out from time to time. So we are not funded in the same way Europe is funded for marketing and promotions, which is unfortunate. But we do a lot. In fact, it's rather than a source of frustration, it's a source of pride for me in that we don't have very big budgets, but we manage to be quite prominent and do a lot of really good things. I think we do a lot of really good things. That's not just because I work for the organization. I think we do really good stuff. So.
And you're also an author.
I am an author, recently sort of freshly baked author of about a year ago. Yeah, I wrote a book called The Wines of Australia.
Mark is a big book nerd when it comes to wine writing. I feel like he has a very full shelf of wine books, and he loves to talk to authors. So I'm sure Mark is full of questions to ask you about your book.
Happy to answer them.
And we have it at the wine school. So it's like got a place of prominence on the front shelf. It's like, oh yeah, we know that guy.
Yeah.
The Wines of Australia, great overview of everything about wine in Australia. You even suggest wines throughout the book. And the first thing I wanted to ask you is, I guess, what's the overview or your perception of the Americans' view on Australian wines? And what is the most asked question or the most misunderstood thing you hear about Australian
That's a really good question, and hopefully I can answer it within the next hour.
Well, take as much time.
It's a great question. I think the perceptions vary in the US now. I think currently, certainly when I started in this job, because I came from a European wine background. I was living and working in Canada as a sommelier, so I had a very strong background in Europe, which actually helped me in this job, to be honest, strangely. But coming back to Australian wine and recognizing that people were there was a bunch of different sort of perceptions, and it was a bit about age and time frames that people in the industry that had been sort of working in the industry or consumers, but it was either, oh, big oaky alcoholic wines a la the, promoted by Robert Parker, that's going back to sort of early 2000s, or it was, oh yeah, I've heard of Yellowtail, or it's just like, oh great, you guys make Shiraz. Whichever group of people or whoever was perceiving that was always very monochromatic. This is Australia, this is the one thing. And I actually blame us as Australian marketers and promoters, not us, me specifically, but people for creating that perception, because the reality is that it's anything but that. It's not monochromatic. It's an extremely exciting wine producing country. I would not have stepped out of what I was doing and coming back to work specifically with Australia if I didn't think there was a fun story and really diverse and interesting wines. And I think so perception problems, the newer generation that comes to sort of seminars, that they actually don't know what I'm talking about when I bring that stuff up, which is kind of cool, because it's like, I'm just here to learn. I don't know that much about Australia at all. So that's kind of cool. I think it's fair to say that it's a bit of a singular sort of narrow view of Australian wine. And which I think is a shame. And that was at the heart of what I put in the back of the book. The reason I did what I did in the back of the book was exactly that, which was as I was writing things down, because that wasn't something, this is a series, which I know you probably have seen, by the Classic Wine Library, which is now Académie du Vin. And it was commented on a reviewer saying, I actually really like this idea. We haven't seen that before with them. But it was more that I'm sort of, as I'm going along, people have no clue. They just don't understand. So what I'm going to do is I'm writing the book, and there's a particular style and variety as or style that shows you the complexity. I'm going to have a list of wines that if you can get through them all in your next sort of period of time or lifetime, you will understand clearly and unequivocally the diversity and character of Australian wine. So it could have been 76, it could have been 41, and it ended up 100 when I finished the book. So I just added one to make it 101. But I literally was just about, no, this is the key thing and the key problem with Australian wine in the export markets is people just don't understand the complexity and diversity. It's not as narrow. So I think in a broad sort of segmented way, that's kind of how I think Americans view it. But, there are some green shoots of growth in other areas, which I think is kind of fun.
I think it's interesting that you brought up that sort of two sides of the same coin back in kind of the early 2000s. That's when I was getting into the industry, and it was totally that way. It's like Australian wines were split into two separate categories in our very giant store. You either had the Molly Dukers, over on the lay down shelf at 15.5% alcohol, these big giant tannin fruit bomb things, or you had the Yellowtails, like way on the other end of the store, practically with the vodka. And people either did one or the other. And there was very, very little crossover from the consumer side. Like getting one to do the other, it was almost like these were two completely separate categories of wine.
And Australia has had why people got bored.
Right. And there was sort of that, like what we had in the market here was very monochromatic, and Australian wine has had kind of a roller coaster ride in the American market in the
that's
in the 25 years in between. It's fun and interesting seeing how it is perceived now, and also the specific wines that we are now seeing in the market, especially like tastings that you've done here in Massachusetts specifically. We've had some really interesting things that you've been able to show us, new grape varieties that are unusual, at least to us as coming from Australia, and slightly different styles than we're used to. Shirazes with a little bit of a lighter hand, lower alcohol. So hoping that this new generation of consumers who don't have these preconceived ideas about what is Australian wine will get excited about them.
Yeah, it's a challenge also, is that, and we've all been in the business long enough where if you think back to when I got into wine and 40 years ago, there was regions and countries that were virtually irrelevant in terms of the average consumer. Now they're not. Greece was, Bretsina and, some other. Sicily was Corvo Bianco and Corvo Rosso and a bunch of awful masala. Sicily couldn't be more exciting, and you can multiply that by another 20, 30, 40, 50 places. And so it just means that people have a sport for choice. And so we always have to kind of just wedge in there and put the best foot forward of showing what is diverse and what's interesting about Australia. And unfortunately, Shiraz has, been tarred with an unfortunate brush, because I think most people are like, Shiraz, no thanks, what else you got? Which is a shame, because there's so much good stuff that does exist. But yeah.
Mark, let's talk about some history of Australian wine for our listeners, because people may not not be familiar, grapes are not native to Australia, and you have roughly 100 varietals growing there now, correct?
Yeah, plus
If
plus there's a lot of stuff in quarantine, some Greek varieties coming out of quarantine. But yeah, there's commercially viable, there's over 100 grape varieties in Australia. We're not like Italy necessarily, but yeah.
Can you just talk to the listeners about the different grapes and varietals they'll see from Australia, and also explain, which I get a common question a lot, and Kim may as well, the differences in about seasons in Australia compared to US?
Yeah. So the different varieties, well, we've got all the classics that you would have, because you can think about it when Busby, the sort of forefather of viticulture in Australia, when the 1830s went to Europe, he went to where famous wines were being produced, and which was France, Spain, and Portugal, because fortifieds are important. So all the varieties that seem to be popular that we know of and love in the US, Cabernet, Shiraz, Grenache for that matter, a little bit later on Chardonnay, Pinot, and a bunch. So all the classic stuff you can kind of find there in greater or less degrees. And then the development, I think, that's exciting over the last 20, yeah, it's getting close to 20 years now, is that with an eye to what's happening with the environment, things are changing, things are decided to adapt. A lot of producers started playing around with different varieties, looking at this overall warming of different zones. And so the idea would be like, what varieties are going to hold their natural acidity, hold their freshness, be appropriate and fit for purpose for the future. So a lot of southern Mediterranean varieties went into the ground, and a bit of shotgun, some showing more promise than others, but all showing some interest in things now. And I'm going to pick on the ones that I like, but Fiano Vermentino, absolutely, you're drinking that when you're in McLaren Vale or in other regions. Nero d'Avola, and I've been to Sicily and I love Nero, but Nero d'Avola is really one that's, I think, showing really interesting character, but you can find dozens of different varieties. There's like, I think, 19 producers of Grüne Veltliner in the Adelaide Hills area, and it's not rubbishy. It's like, this actually is a variety suited to it. So there's all these little pockets of interest that I think is really sort of changing the sort of complexity and adding to this nice sort of tapestry of what is Australian wine. So I think that's the fun part. It is easier for people to go, well, what's the one thing Australia does? Well, I will not answer that question ever, and I know you're not asking that one, because nobody asked that question of France. But they do of Australia. What's the one thing in Australia? Well, it's like, what's the one thing in France? You wouldn't get that answer from an Italian. You wouldn't get that answer from a French person. You're going to get it from me, because there's lots of great things. And it is about exploration and experimentation, which is the name of the game. And in fairness, there are some other countries where it is a bit more narrow. But for us, it's like, no, it's not about being narrow. It's about being broad. Annoyingly so, but that's the way it is. So it's the second part of the question, which you asked and I've forgotten. What was it?
Growing seasons.
Oh, growing, yeah, well, the opposite, obviously. In terms of, it's not, I mean, people say, oh, it's so hot there all the time. It's like, well, no, we have winter season. It's not tropical there where we are growing grapes. It certainly is in the north. So the reality is most of Australia is absolutely not suited to growing grapes. You have to be further from the equator, because the top of Australia is tropical. Excellent bananas, pineapples, sugar cane, so also all sorts of other yummy treats up there. The middle's a desert. So down south is where these cooling effects of the ocean, which is, next stop south of Australia is Antarctica. So there's cooling effects of the ocean and some altitude. And then you've got proper seasons where there's a dormancy period. So it's not really appreciably different from parts of the US or frankly parts of Europe. It's just, depends kind of where you are as to how warm the summers are and how mild the winters are compared to places where it snows and it's cold. Tasmania's like, it's not easy. It's hard to ripen warmer climate varieties in Tasmania. So we've got a lot of diversity there, but the seasons, really the only thing to answer about seasons, that they're opposite. That's all.
And is it fairly consistent from year to year? Like, do you have a lot of differences between one vintage or another, or does it tend to be
recently? Yeah, actually, because we've had some, interestingly, because with climate change and to a lot of the growers, nobody's arguing the science of climate change, but we've actually had a couple of coldest vintages in 40 plus years, 2023 being one of them. So there's been some, but I think the climate change thing is that, yes, for sure, overall, if you look at the temperature, things are going up, but it's more the dramatic weather events that are happening. Frost at times that normally doesn't happen, or these hail at times where it historically hasn't happened. And I think that's where the climate. And then there's actually, strangely, a couple of places in Australia, and if you look at the climate atlas that Wine Australia put out a long while ago, there's a couple of places that have not changed, which is funny. And you can find that in other parts of the world too. Everyone always says, oh, Australia, the climate's getting hotter and hotter. Well, actually, there's a couple of regions, wine regions of parts of Australia where actually that isn't the case for the last 40 years. It remains the same. So nobody's bulletproof, but there are some areas that are a bit more sort of, stable than others. And I think that's true of everywhere. But yeah, So that's the Coles Notes version of Australian environment.
I remember a few years ago, we were doing shows talking about it was like the crazy year of wildfires, both
Yeah.
for you guys, for us here in California. I think it was like Spain had wildfires too. So
The
those
Okanagan
all of those
Valley in
other
Canada.
factors.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. I had someone as a student doing her thesis on climate change, and she just called me. She's over at Cornell, and I had a chat with her. And she's picked Australia, but I said to her what I'll say to you, what I said to her, which is it's funny because Australia does. Oh, it's well, climate change is happening everywhere. It's not just in Australia. The thing about Australia that is whether this is an advantage or not, we've been drought prone forever. That's the way Australia operates. It's a boom
Mhm.
bust if that's the right expression for it. It's not a question of, oh gee, you're going to have another drought. Yeah, we are. There's cycles. It's to do with the Indian Ocean dipole. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that happens, but we are a drought prone country in certain places more than others. So we know it's coming, but because of that, we've got great water management practices, some really cool things happening in various regions, but also within certain companies. And some of the things like smoke taint research and all the things that other people, we've been sort of dealing with that probably a bit longer than others, because those forest fires, we call them bushfires in Australia, but the forest fires in California, Oregon, the Okanagan. I was living in BC, and the Okanagan got hit with their first round of them, and it was almost a yearly occurrence now. So there's a lot of interplay now with other places, other regions, with what Australia's research and findings have been. So we've been sort of at the forefront of some of that, and I think, yeah, it's not a fun subject, it's a frightening, and anyone that has been involved or been near those forest fires or bushfires, it is no joke. It's frightening. It's some of the most frightening stuff you'll ever encounter in your life, just because the speed, the sound, the environment, it's really not a pleasant experience, but it's happening everywhere.
Thank you for joining us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. You can find out our information on our new website, thewww.wine. Today, our special guest is Mark Davidson. He's the author of The Wines of Australia. You can find him on Instagram at Vintage Mark Davo. You can also find him on Facebook. And the website for Wines Australia is AustralianWineDiscovered.com. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio, and you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at The Wonderful World of Wine. We're back talking with Mark Davidson, author of The Wines of Australia. Mark, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the importance of fortified wines in Australia. Can you explain for our listeners fortified wines and its history in Australia and what it's all about there?
Sure, yeah. Probably stems back from the original foundation of the colonies there, and several people interested in viticulture and winemaking, and one of them was James Busby. When he went back to Europe and self-funded, went back, he was so convinced about what he'd seen there. He went back to Europe early 1830s and did a bunch of cuttings and brought them back, and Spain and Portugal were on that list. And I think it's because at the time we were a colony, so we were sort of being told what to do a little bit, but it was also like fortifieds were popular, way more popular in those days, and it was a question of make them, ship them back to the UK because you're a colony and they're sort of our wines, if you like. It then became, in amongst some very good wines being made, probably from the mid 1800s, some table wines, fortified wine production was somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of production. Bearing in mind in those days, production was quite a bit smaller than it is today, but 70% of production for many decades was predominantly fortified wines. By fortified wines for Australian purposes, it would be ports. We don't use that term anymore, but vintage style ports, very much tawny style ports. We call them just tawnies and fortified tawnies and vintage fortifieds. And then these really specialist wines from up in a Rutherglen area called Rutherglen Muscat, and what was called Rutherglen Tokay, which was Muscadel, now called Topake. It's another history there, but it's sort of centered around those. So for well over 100 years, those wines have been made. They're still being made, albeit in smaller quantities, and I'm really thrilled that history is contained, because I mean, probably 60s and 70s that started to dwindle, and by the 80s that was no longer the predominant production. It was table wines. Most of the top producers that have been making fortifieds continue to do so because they sort of view themselves, and I hope this never changes, I genuinely hope this doesn't change, they kind of view themselves as custodians of a piece of Australian history, especially in Rutherglen, because for a fact, anyone in the business knows for a fact that fortifieds are not where they used to be. They just aren't. And I always joke with I can say it on this, I guess, my wanker wine friends, we all go, whoa, we all love sherry, and then when you get a group of somms and trade afraid. It's like, when was the last time you bought a bottle? Everyone then hesitates, but we all love it. We all love sherry
Right.
port. Well, if we love it so much, you get out there and buy some stuff and drink it on a regular basis. But yeah, I mean, it's dwindled, but it is a magic piece of the Australian history. And just to go off on a tangent on one particular producer, which was one of those seminal moments in wine for me among many I've had in Europe, but going to a place called Seppeltsfield, wines are now here in the US. You do a whole show on Seppeltsfield and how smart they were, but the Seppelt family, and there's a gentleman called Benno Seppelt that making these fortified wines. So in 1878, put this in perspective, said, we're going to lay down a barrel of this fortified. So effective, it was a vintage dated tawny. He said, we're not releasing that for 100 years. And they've done that ever since.
Wow.
That's continued to this day. You can go in there and try the current release, which is 100 years. So the 2025 will be released. Sorry, the 1925 will be released in May. Every May they release it. And I've had the fortune of being able to try them. And you can go in and try your birth year. And it's one of those amazing
100
experiences.
years. Wow.
Yeah, but what a vision, and
Mhm.
and to be able to maintain doing that. It's just a tiny little story, but it's an amazing story that speaks to that sort of quality control, or the quality aspirations, rather, is the better word for what was happening. That was 1878. So this is the 1880s. Like, that was the thought process. And it's just magic. And I love that. And I spoke to a port producer who his family used to own Quinta Noval, and he said, yeah, we can do older vintage port. We cannot give you effectively unbroken 150 plus years of colheita, which is effectively what that is, right? Vintage dated tawnies. And he said, I don't think we can do that in Portugal. I thought, well, that's kind of special. So there are some amazing stories like that with history. And nice to be reminded that, yeah, for a quote unquote new world country, there's some old world aspiration and old world style history there too.
Yeah. I don't
Beautiful
think that
stuff.
we often think about Australia as a country that has this history of wine growing and
Correct.
wine making. I think a lot of people, no offense, and I'm sure you've heard this before,
Oh,
kind of wrap Australia and New Zealand together, and
oh,
I'm sorry.
it's
But those of us who read history books about wine and things like that, we know how far back the winemaking traditions of the country go. And to still have some of those producers who have those stories, who had that vision, as you said, the foresight to be thinking so far ahead. That's cool. I had not heard that before. So
yeah, and it is interesting because, yes, for sure, Australia, New Zealand, I always start my lecture saying, just remember, we're different countries. If you think about a lot of other New World countries, there was some issue, like California would have that sort of tradition, but prohibition
yeah, exactly.
created a break, right? South Africa had apartheid, which ruined a lot of what they were doing even with domestically and their export. And then that lasted for 15, 16 years. Maybe I'm wrong on that timing. And look, I've been to Chile. I haven't spent much time in Argentina. To me, that's about the future rather than a fine wine tradition. And I'm not being critical there. It's just a reality. Fine wine production, there's not a lot of backdating history into the 1800s of fine wine production in those countries. It's more about sort of larger volume. So Australia's a bit unique in the New World in that there's been a fine wine tradition back to the mid 1800s, which, even if it was small back in the day, there was still aspirations. And I think that's what makes it, to me, what makes it very, very interesting. I love having those classic wines because no matter what people might think about, oh, you got this, you got that. So yeah, we also have Grange, we have Hill of Grace, we've got these fortified wines, we've got this tradition that's wonderful to be able to look back on, and it's nice.
Mark, both you and Kim had mentioned some of the brands, the big brands that people in the United States are used to for Australian wines. Yellowtail, Linderman's. They put
Yeah.
really Australian wines on the map in this country. What has changed with Yellowtail? Has the volume declined? I have a million questions about Yellowtail specifically because you really only talked about maybe a little paragraph in your book about one of probably a brand that put Australian wines on the map. But do Australians get upset that Americans were introduced to the wines of Australia from a brand like that and maybe are not gravitating towards the great single vineyard or small
Yeah,
producers
look, it's a
because of
really
that?
that's such an interesting question because I deal with this all the time. And there's a lot of people in the industry say Yellowtail ruined the image of Australian wine. I'm like, no, and I mentioned this in the book, but like you said, I don't give it enough ink space because you could do it. I mean, when the success of Yellowtail was required reading there was a part of that story that was required reading at Harvard Business School for a couple of years because that's how meteoric the rise of a particular brand was and all the elements that came together, including a bit of luck. To my mind, that was wonderful innovation and wonderful stuff because you've got all manner of brands in the US that have mirrored similar things. They've done really well. The problem was unimaginative producers came into Australia and said, we can get a slice of this big American pie. Let's just create the same sort of a thing. thing, all these copycat brands. Now, that gave the impression that that's mostly what Australia was doing, because there was laziness from retail, and I think that's fair to say that the retailers were a bit lazy on it, but we were also lazy in what we were showing, because at the same time as that, we should have been doing the same thing that people like Mondavi were doing back in the day, promoting the great wines of Napa, because big commercial brands come from every single country. That should be a piece of the puzzle and discussed along with these other things, because you got to remember, before Yellowtail outside into the export market outside of the US, there was Jacobs Creek, was the Chardonnay was the biggest selling white wine in the UK for probably a decade. So we've had these big brands that have done well, but they needed to be peppered with other story of Australian wine, in the same way that French wines or California wines did it. So all the copycat brands are gone. Yellowtail's still there making wine. They're innovative. They're coming up with new things. Numbers for sure. I don't have that at my fingertips, and I probably should, but the reality is that has shrunk, but they're a successful, smart, innovative company that is not going away. I just think that forms a piece of it. But I mean, for sure, we're seeing it probably across the board. The appetite for cheap and cheerful like that from Australia has diminished. That's a reality. So people are looking for other things. And I think there's a simplification when people say people are drinking less, drinking better. I mean, everyone's been saying that for a long time, but there's a part of that is true. But yeah, the Yellowtail story, I love it. It's like saying Sutter Home White Zinfandel ruined the California image. It's like, well, no, it didn't, because the average American got to see more and got to, other people out there promoting other parts of the wine business that were very, very exciting and interesting and layered, because the wine business is segmented, and we just became that. The Critter brand.
The Critters, yes. Oh, gosh.
Led by Yellowtail, which, it's unfortunate that people pick on Yellowtail, because I certainly don't. I think they're a very smart company. And hey, like I said, they're still there, still doing it.
I want to hit a little bit on kind of restaurant exposure to Australian wines. And I saw a recent article. It was why Australian wines deserve placement in your program. And I'd like feedback from you. When you're looking at restaurant lists, are you disappointed with the representation? Because I can tell you, when I go to a restaurant, I see very few on wine lists. Why do you think that is, even from educated somms that don't want to give it exposure like it should be?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Look, it's been the bane of my existence, because I come from that background. It was the focus when I started. I've been doing this 15 years now. Not at all the time span I expected. And the funny thing is COVID did more damage to us than you could even imagine, because there was some momentum. Right before COVID, we did a couple of very big events at Tahoe. We had 100 people each year for 2 years in a row, top people. And it was at a point where I remember going into New York, and someone said, oh, you got to go to Crown Shy, this hot new restaurant. And I went, and not a som that I'd quote unquote indoctrinated went in, and there was all this cool Aussie stuff there. I'm like, wow, this is great. So there were just things were happening. And then all the people that we spent maybe 10 years working with, either taking to Australia, engaging with them, that were running programs, they're not anymore, and it's gone away. And the problem is, front of mind is really important. But even back then, it was still slim pickings, but it was getting better. Now I feel like we're back to square one. I feel like nothing, even though it's not true, but you feel like, oh my God, everything I've done for the last 15 years has been pointless. But I know that's not 100% true, but I feel like you do. I go into restaurants and go, wow, are you kidding me? This is just, nothing. There might be a bottle of Grange and Hill of Grace, which I'm happy about, but that doesn't tell you the full story of Australian wine. And all the way along, and it feeds into your comment or the discussion about how much is available to people right now. To me, it would be great if at some point, when you're putting together an international list, there are just certain wines you have to have on an international list. And I would like 5 or 6 of those to be Australian, right? Where it's like, if you've got a list and you're being, top-notch Italian, a top-notch international list, you have to have champagne, whatever you decide. Chablis has to be there, Burgundy, Bordeaux. I would just like that to be 4 or 5 styles from Australia that are important, not just to Shiraz, but Barossa Shiraz, a Grenache from McLaren Vale, Pinot Noir from Yarra Valley, a top-notch sparkling wine from Tasmania. And I think we'll know we're getting somewhere when that is, you need an Aussie section, and you need to have several styles of like classic Australian wine, and some contemporary stuff as well. But we see it from time to time. But boy, I'm with you, Mark. There are so many times. But then I could say that if I could feel the same if I was from other countries too, to be brutally honest. And I think that contraction, job changes, all sorts of other things COVID really had an impact. You can definitely see it. And we came back with after the tariffs from China, Australia's funding was different and a lot more people were being sent to other countries, and we're slowly getting back into being able to bring people down. And that engagement, that front of mind thing for people is really important, more so today than ever before, because if you're not in their face talking to them all the time, Austria is, or South Africa is, or some other country is, and you can't blame the buyers. They're like, well, I've got all this stuff here. Like it's a tricky piece.
Yeah, that's the good thing. You have all the things wine geeks love, right? And
Yes.
they just need to see it more and taste it more. And
They do. People are just shocked. You show them like, oh, but what about natural wines and pet wines? Yeah, I said we've got some like amazing stuff, but it's like, there's a full spectrum, and that's my argument and my consistent argument. And this is coming back from years ago, hanging around a lot of my MW and MS friends that up in Vancouver. We're all sitting around drunk one night, and it was like, okay, one country, that's it. You can only drink wine from one country. What's it going to be? Look, the argument was between three countries: Italy, France, and France ended up winning because there's Burgundy and there's champagne. Probably because of champagne.
It was probably champagne.
And Australia was in the discussion too, because if you look at it, there is every single conceivable wine style that you could ever imagine, from magnificent, rich, aged, fortified wines, light, delicate, sparkling wines that made in the traditional method, and everything in between. And so it's there. So yeah, but oh man, it is hard, isn't it? Breaking an image. It's not easy.
Yeah. So kind of on that point, my plug for my favorite wines from Australia are the dry Rieslings. But that's like a twofold needing to break an image issue, not only the Australia thing, but also this idea that a lot of consumers still think that all Rieslings are going to be sweet. And I don't know that I have ever had a sweet Riesling from Australia that was just stable wine.
They do exist.
Do they? Okay.
Yeah, no, they do exist. Even some off-dry wines from the Clare Valley. But no, you're absolutely right. The vast majority.
There's some absolute stunners for dry Riesling. And if I have to pick one place in the world for dry Riesling, I'm not going to Germany. I'm going to Australia. They really are amazing.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I mean, that's been my thing for years. It's like, man, this stuff should be on by the glass because it's
so good.
Well, no, I'd pick something like, say, Pusey Vale Riesling, which is 12% alcohol, maybe 12.5. That would be a high a year. It's got the juicy acidity. It's got all that freshness, that liveliness that everyone loves about, say, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. But what's the problem? It says Riesling on the bottle. And then, as you said, people go, I don't like Riesling, it's sweet. And they say it with that stupid voice as well. But there's, but slowly that's changing, but it's never going to be to the point that we all in the industry feel like it should be and have thought that for like 20 or 30 years. Yeah, the Riesling's the next best thing, but yeah, it's not going to happen. But yeah, there's so much good Riesling in Australia. Yeah, for me, it's Australia. It's also Austria. Austria and Australia, to me, they're like the pinnacle. We're great.
Yeah, it's that like racy, dry, high acid. Oh, I love that stuff too.
The vineyard behind me.
Oh, yes.
You can't see on the that's Pusey Vale. That's why it's racy, because that's 550 meters above sea level right there. That's the Eden Valley.
That's probably, at least to our market here in Massachusetts, probably the easiest dry Riesling from Australia for us to get our hands on. So we certainly use a lot of it at the wine school. It's But
delicious. To your point, Mark, I love being in Boston for a number of reasons, because they say my name correctly. You do. Mark, get in the car.
Mark.
Love it.
That's right.
Mark.
But oysters. Everywhere I go, is you just one place after another, and you think, you know what? There should be some Aussie Riesling by the glass in some of these places, and I don't even think there's one. And that's like, it's an excellent oyster wine, or for that matter, a Hunter Semillon, not even just Riesling. Wonderful oyster wines. But maybe that's what I need to do when I come to Boston. We do oysters and Semillon.
Oh, let's do an oyster thing.
Kim, did you have an Australian wine on the legal seafoods list when you were there?
Oh, I don't even remember anymore. See, now it's 5 years ago, so
that's bad for Mark.
Yeah, I don't think we did. I feel like maybe we had a Semillon though. I mean, Sandy loved Riesling, so
he did. Yeah, I remember. I did meet with him.
Adored Riesling. It was probably his favorite grape variety, and at least a couple of times a year he would do just like a Riesling tasting seminar for the people that were on his mailing list, and there would always be multiple Rieslings included in there from Australia, because he just would wax poetical about about
Well, in
Riesling.
my
He
list
adored the
of
grape variety.
101 wines to drink at the back of my book, I've got, I think, 9 of them are Rieslings. Not
Mm.
because it was more about, hey, that list is about list within list as well. It's like, hey, if you want to understand Riesling from Australia, yeah, Clare and Eden, absolutely. But I tell you what, there's a bunch of other areas if you can get access to them, that's where the challenge lies. But
Yeah,
one of my
absolutely.
favorite Rieslings actually on the planet, but certainly in Australia, is actually from Henty, a place called Crawford River in Henty, which is Western Victoria, over near the South Australian border. Massive, just like to one of the most amazing. But it's got more weight and texture, but this is searing spine of acidity. But this, yeah, absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, and it's nice to step outside the framework of Clare and Eden from time to time and see what other Rieslings are being produced.
Uh-huh.
Tasmania, Western Australia, there's some really good Riesling.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's what we tend to talk about. We tend to talk about Clare
Absolutely.
and Eden as far as like the places for Riesling in Australia. But obviously, there's always those producers that kind of break preconceived notion of where things should be grown. And so we're trying and experimenting in other places as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Mark, one of the last things I want to ask you, we always like to give the listeners some tips about shopping for wines. When our listeners are in a store or looking at a restaurant list, what are some of the things they will see on Australian wine labels as far as laws or regulations? Something they can.
Look, there's nothing particularly tricky, I think, because we have appellation laws, but they're not multi-level like the appellation laws in France, where by looking at this place name, because I mean obviously there's many areas in Europe, but France being the most obvious, where the wines are named after where they're from and the vineyards they're from, they're not labeled according to their variety for the most part. Australia's very different. It's varietal first, but then the region next. And what our laws cover is that, yeah, absolutely, it has to be authentically from there. There's no ifs, buts, and ands. It's an authenticity piece, and there's label integrity. If you've said it's Pinot Noir or whatever, that's what it's got to be, and that's what the vintage is. And there's some variations, like there's a 5% for vintage or whatever. But the reality is that it's pretty straightforward, very easy to read, in the sense that if you know a bit about grape varieties and a little bit about Aussie geography, you're going to be in pretty good shape, because it'll say Shiraz, Barossa Valley, or Pinot Noir from. And so I think the trick to it is to, maybe as a good starting point for people, is like, okay, well, what varieties do you like? If it's Pinot Noir, learn a couple of the varieties. A couple of the regions where Pinot Noir is really prominent and does really well, be it Yarra Valley and Mornington, and you can sort of see that on our website that you mentioned earlier, or certainly in my book. Where are the places? But if there's one single tip I'd give to people right now, if you see something with the word Tasmania on it, just buy it, because Tasmania is hot to trot, and I mean that in the cool sense of it. But there's so much good stuff coming out of Tasmania right now. Great, some of the best sparkling wine, brilliant Chardonnays, brilliant Pinots, but it's cool climate. So if you want to see another side of Australia, Tasmania is a wonderful place to head straight towards, because it's showing you that lighter, more fragrant, ethereal sort of side of Australian wine. And I could add all manner of places on the mainland, but there's a simple little tip. Tassie's
Traditional wine making method for sparkling.
All the best stuff is very much follows through. And then, because Jan's has always been popular in the marketplace, but now we've got House of Aros that's come back to the US in a much more prominent way. And you're looking at very similar varieties to traditional champagne production. So Chardonnay Pinot dominant with some Pinot Meunier, very, very common, that sort of blend. Typically 24 months on tirage. Usually the better producers are closer to 4 years. So you're getting that sort of extra layers of complexity, but all very much following the traditional method of production, and fun, cheap, and cheerful stuff. There's actually a lot of prosecco in Australia. The prosecco grape is grown, and they don't export because of the naming thing. But
the name, yeah, actually, I remember reading some articles about that.
Yeah, it's a long story, but it's also, I think the world has a lot of gratitude to be able to pay to prosecco for getting sparkling wine into the everyday drinking category.
Yeah.
Prosecco, like, that did it. That was the door that got swung open. People, oh, I love Prosecco. Whereas in the past, sparkling wine, that's a special occasion, right? We do that at weddings. So I think Prosecco has been one of those door openers. So it's helped a lot of sparkling wine from other parts of the world to be able to sell, I think.
I love the silver lining. It's like, yes, little bit of positive news from the wine world.
Yeah, it's like a bit negative
these
recently,
days there's so much doom and gloom. I didn't want to bring up any of the doom and gloom things on the show. We'll keep this one positive.
Well, great. Mark, thank you very much. I hope our listeners will check out your book, The Wines of Australia. Go to the website because there's so much to learn. I think, the good thing about Australian wines, and anybody who's done wine education, it's one of those things you like covered because it's really straightforward. It's easy to learn the regions, has good quality wines, but as from a wine geek perspective, it's a region you like to study, I feel. So
yeah, it is. I think that's a really nice way to do it. But it's true. It's not I loved all that digging in and trying to understand French wine laws and all the things. In the end, it's not wine enjoyment's not about those laws, but for a personal thing, I loved uncovering that. Oh wow, Puy Fuisse is made from Chardonnay. What the heck's that? That's what opened the door for me. It's like, why does it taste different from this really oaky thing I'm drinking in Australia? But the reality is that those are not what it's about for the average person. The average person just wants to know if it's tasty. And I think with Australia, there's a bare minimum of quality is quite high. The minimum quality standard in Australia is high, so you can rest assured that what you're going to get in the bottle is going to be decent quality. It's just a question of sort of opening the door and going scratching around a bit and going, oh well, I like Pinot. Wow, Australia makes really good Pinot. Where in Australia do I need to learn that? And the other thing too, I think that if there's one other area, there's Grenache, one of my favorite varieties. Generally, there's just been this revolution in terms of how single varietal Grenache has been made. So if you find some Grenache from Australia, play around with that at the same time. That's another on top of Tassie.
Thank you for listening to us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We have been your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, with special guest Mark Davidson. You can find more information about Mark on his website, australianwinediscovered.com. You can find more information about ourselves at thewww.wine. And as always, we are supported by Franklin Public Radio. You can find our past episodes on SoundCloud. And as always, leave us your questions and comments on our Facebook page, The Wonderful World of Wine. Cheers.
Cheers.